All right, welcome.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
So I am going to, actually, would you construct this
sure.
budget constraint?
Yes, let's start with is it like a question that they had, or is it, or we're just creating something out of?
So what we're going to do is we're going to go over a few topics that we noticed people either asked questions about or missed on the quiz. I'm going to start by constructing a budget constraint and showing how we can interpret changes in price by looking at a budget constraint. And Professor Fernando is going to draw the axes for me while I go check on our live stream feed.
All right, okay. Sounds good. All right, so we're going to have two goods. Let's say we have apples and bananas, right? So I'm going to put the quantity of apples on the horizontal axis, and we're going to put the quantity of bananas on the vertical axis. Okay. Now, let's say that we give a consumer 24 bucks. So I'm going to call it M. And let's say that the price of apples is $2. So I'm going to call it PA, or price of apples. It's going to be $2 each. And the price of bananas, let's keep this as simple as possible, is also $2, right? Are we going well, or is that we're going well?
We are.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's all you need to know, really. And I don't care if you want to start drawing the budget constraint.
Yeah. Thank you, Fernando. I think we're operational here. So if we have income of $24 and the price of apples is $2, then the maximum quantity of apples we can afford is 12. And if the price of bananas is $2, then the maximum price of bananas we can afford is 12. So let's put bananas up here. Okay, and we can construct our budget constraint. Oh, don't like it. To look something like this. And I'm going to just mark some points in it because we'll be referencing these points later. Okay. Now let's say something changes. And I'm not going to tell you what changes, but we're going to look at a new budget constraint. Something changes and our new budget constraint looks like this. So we'll put that right here. What happened? Well, we can look at this budget constraint and say, if we spend all of our income on bananas, it looks like we can purchase 12 bananas, or the same quantity of bananas. So nothing happened to the price of bananas. Also, we see here that if we spend all of our income on apples, we can only purchase 6 apples, where before we could purchase 12. So we should notice that our budget set has shrunk, and suggesting that the price of apples has risen. So our price of apples has risen from 2 to 4. So if we spend all of our income, we can only purchase 6 apples. If our income is 24 divided by 6 is 4. So we can see from this picture that the price of apples has risen. So in some homework and quiz questions, I noticed that there was some difficulty. If you saw 2 budget constraints, you weren't sure, just by looking at them, which one represented a budget constraint with a higher price of apples compared to a lower price of apples. So hopefully walking through this has helped a little. Now let's use this budget constraint and plot it put it in an indifference curve showing the optimal quantity of apples and bananas at the initial prices and then the new with the new price of apples. So I have my sheet here. I think I wanted to start out at, what were we at?
I think it was 5 and 7.
5 and 7.
Yep.
5, here's 7 up here. So that
Yeah,
suggested
5 and
5 here. So let's make this 7. Let's make this 5. Oops, that's is it 5 and 7? This is 7.
Yeah, that was the 7.
This is 7. This is 5. There we go. So 5 times 2 for apples, that's 10. So I'm spending $10 on apples. 7 times 2 bananas, that's 14. So I'm spending $14 on bananas. That sums up to 24. So good job, Professor Fernando. That works. We did it. All right, so we're going to carefully sketch in an indifference curve here. Looks nice.
It's pretty beautiful.
All right. Looks good. So our example consumer here, who has this set of preferences, this income, and faces a price of $2 per unit of apple and $2 per unit of banana, is maximizing her utility with this consumption bundle of 5 apples and 7 bananas. Okay, just as a quick question, Fernando, how can we tell?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll be happy to answer that question. What you want to do is you want to think of the budget as a constraint on the individual, right? This individual is going to be much better off by consuming this bundle that has, I don't know, whatever this has, right? What is that, a 10? Oops, no, that looks more like a, yeah, it's a 10. And maybe that's 13. This bundle is preferred over this one. So why don't you buy this one instead? Well, you don't have enough money. Which ones are the bundles that you can afford? Any bundle that is at this line you're spending your $24, or to the left and below it, where you're spending less. So all the bundles that are inside this triangle are the ones that you can afford. Now, you prefer this one over this one. And of course, if I draw another indifference curve, I don't want to ruin what's coming next, but let's just hope that works. Then, for example, this one is also affordable, but notice that it's on a lower indifference curve. Notice what happens if I draw indifference curves, or an indifference curve that's higher up. Well, look at all these bundles. They're all preferred over this one, but they're not affordable. And so the idea of optimal choice under scarcity is that you're going to pick, of all the bundles that are affordable, the one that gives you maximum utility. And which one is it? The one that puts you at an indifference curve that is tangent to the budget line. So that's the explanation.
Excellent. Thank you.
We're going to repeat this process with multiple budget constraints as we change the price of apples, and we're going to see what happens. All right.
So now let's change the price of apples. The price of apples goes from 2 to 4. Now our consumer here would like to stay here, but can't, because this black budget constraint right here, this is no longer the relevant budget constraint. The consumer is now constrained here and must choose a consumption bundle that's either on this line or somewhere inside. And in order to figure out what our consumer would choose, we need to draw in some new indifference curves.
But you want to draw them so that it's tangent at 2 for apples and 8 for bananas.
All right.
So see if you can do that.
We worked this out in advance, so we could do this nicely. Without mathematical tools, we have to eyeball in our indifference curves, and it can be easy to make a mistake. But I think I've got it.
And you can draw as many indifference curves as you want. Remember that. Just never cross them, because it wouldn't make sense.
because all of these represent some level of utility, and only the ones that either touch the budget line or fall below include bundles that are affordable. So this new consumption bundle of 8 bananas and 2 apples, or 2 apples and 8 bananas, this is affordable to our consumer. So 2 apples at $4 an apple.
You got $8 on apples.
$8 on apples. 8 bananas at $2 a banana. There's $16 on bananas. 8 and 16 is 24. We're spending all of our budget and doing the absolute best we can. So what I'm going to do now is quickly clean up this mess that I've made here, so we can make some comparisons, and then also remove this example indifference curve that Professor Fernando drew. Redraw our line.
Yeah, that cleans it up a little.
Cleans it up a little so you can see it. And then now, let's take a look at our 2 consumption bundles. So what do we know? Price of apples increased. And what makes sense is that in response to an increase in the price of apples, the quantity of apples consumed decreased. We saw that happen. We went from 5 apples to 2 apples. Now, price of apples increased, and the quantity of bananas also changed. It's here that we can determine the relationship between apples and bananas. So how does our example consumer perceive apples and bananas? If she increases her consumption of bananas, then she views them as substitutes.
Exactly.
If she decreased her consumption of bananas, she viewed them as complements. Maybe she likes salads and likes to eat them together. If they're substitutes, she could replace one with the other. And we can tell by looking at her indifference curve here. So our indifference curves and budget constraint and our optimal consumption bundle. We notice our example consumer increased her consumption of bananas in response to an increase in the price of apples. That means they are substitutes. Perfect. So the quantity of bananas increased. She increased her consumption of bananas from 7 to 8. Apples and bananas are substitutes.
All right.
So we will clean up this.
You don't have to clean up anything.
All right, Professor Fernando is going to take it from here.
Yes. So, all right. So if you understood that, then you should be able to understand a very similar experiment, which is instead of increasing the price of apples from 2 to 4, let's decrease the price of apples from 2 to 1 very quickly. And you'll see where I'm going, not yet, but first let's just repeat what we just did a couple seconds ago, but with a new budget constraint. And we have this one as your budget constraint when you have prices of 2 and 2. But what happens if the price of apples goes down to 1? We might need a little bit more. Can we see that? Yes, we can. Well, if the price goes to 1, you have $24. Now you can afford 24 apples, which is way out here. Right? Can see that? Yes. But the price of bananas didn't change, so you can still afford 12 if you spend all your money on bananas. And so I'm going to attempt to draw that a budget constraint. And now we have a new budget constraint. Clearly, we can afford all these bundles now that the price of apples has gone down to 1, but we still want to pick the optimal bundle. Let's say that the optimal bundle is 14. Looks like 14. Ooh, this is bad. Let's say this is 5. All right, bear with me.
No Looks pretty good.
Not quite. Let's put the 14 down. All right. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you how, not the consumption of bananas, because we already talked about the consumption of bananas as it relates to the price of apples. Notice that if this is 14, that means that you're consuming 5 bananas because you're spending $10 on bananas, $14 on apples, and so you're spending $24. And we just said that bananas and apples are substitutes because as the price goes from 1 to 2 to 4, the consumption of bananas goes from 5 to 7 to 8, so it's going up. So you're substituting apples for bananas. But what I wanted to talk about is what happens to the demand for apples. And you can see that as the price of apples goes up, your consumption goes from 14 to 6 to 2. And so we can establish the relation between the price of apples and the quantity demanded of those apples. I'm going to put it here if I can. I think I can do it right. All the way up to here.
We've got the whole
we're
board.
good. Excellent. And so let's plot the prices that we know that we had for apples, 1, 2, and 4, and the corresponding quantities demanded of those apples. So we have 1. So let's put the price of apples here and the quantity of apples here. At a price of 1, what happens? This consumer wants 14 apples. It's way up here. So notice, at a price of 1, consumption of 14. What happens if we increase the price to 2? Well, now this individual wants 5 apples. 5 apples is going to be somewhere here. And those 5 apples get consumed if the price is 2. And finally, what happens if the price rises all the way up to 4, which is the red budget constraint? The consumption of apples drops to 2. So you're going to consume 2 apples if the price goes all the way up to 4. So notice these 3 points that we just plotted, and let's think about repeating this process, not for the prices of 1, 2, and 4, but for a bunch of possible prices, 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, all the way up to 4. What would we get? What we would get is a curve that would tell us, for every possible price of apples, what the corresponding quantity demanded is. So let's plot that curve. What do we call this curve? Well, if you've been watching the videos, you should know. It tells you how much quantity of apples is going to be demanded as it relates to the price of apples. So this is the demand curve. All right, that's how you obtain a demand curve using this consumption bundle graph and moving one of the prices in order to see how demand depends on that price. All right.
That's pretty good.
That
Now,
does that one.
Well, that leaves us with more than a half hour left for Professor Jose. So should we do elasticity, or do you want to jump in there first?
You get to decide.
You guys do elasticity since you're on demand right now.
Okay,
All
we
right,
can do
so
elasticity.
let's
good.
let's calculate the elasticity of
Okay.
this demand curve.
All right. So
Now-
how about we do it from, well, the numbers are going to be weird. All right. From 1 to 2. Does that sound good?
That's probably good. One thing that we need to know about the elasticity is it's not going to be the same all the way across the demand
Do it
curve.
twice.
So we could do it multiple times, or we could pick one spot and understand that it, if we picked a different spot, we would get a different number. So let's do as price rises from 1 to 2.
Yeah, that's good.
So
Can I ask a question though?
Of course.
Can you sort of give me an idea of what you think is going to be the size of the elasticity at different points? You should be able to give me some intuition as to what you expect the elasticity to be, right?
Yes.
Is it going to be a relatively large number?
So My answer, and this really depends on the curvature of the demand curve. And this one has a lot of curvature, so it's a
Okay.
little bit difficult to assess. But as a general rule, when the price is very low, a $1 increase in price is going to create a huge percentage increase in price. And when the price is very low, quantity is very high. So the drop in quantity is typically, and again, this has a lot of curvature, but it's typically a small percentage a decrease in quantity. And so the elasticity will tend to be relatively small because you have a huge increase in price that leads to a very small decrease in percentage terms of quantity.
So what's the percentage increase in price if we go from 1 to 2?
That's the easy one. 100%.
100%. Price is increased by 100%. So if we're going to calculate elasticity, we say, okay, the elasticity is equal to
Percentage increase in quantity.
so the change in quantity divided by the initial quantity that we start out with.
All that divided by.
All this divided by the change in price by the initial price that we start with.
Yeah.
So if we're going to go from 1 to 2, we need to pick, so price, if the price is 1, the quantity is 14. Okay, so we are going to say, all right, our initial price is 1, put $1.
Numbers are going to be horrible.
And then
good luck with that.
the quantity, the quantity is, the initial quantity is 14. Yeah.
So, and the change in quantity is going to be
the change in quantity,
14 minus 5, so that's 9.
14 minus 5, so if we go to 1 to 2, so that's 9. So that's our change in quantity is 9/14. That's a nice number, isn't it? 9/14. And our change in price
is just 1.
Is just $1.
Yeah.
Prices rise. Well, actually, it's -9. So
Yeah.
it's a decrease. We need to be careful because our price is rising by $1.
Let me change this so that people don't get confused. This whole thing is the elasticity.
Yes, thank you. All right. Well, fortunately, $1 over $1 cancels out. And so elasticity is -9/14. And if you wanted to interpret that as a decimal, you just punch it into your calculator.
Yeah, punch it in the calculator, people. It's
It's
still 9
something-
over 14.
It's something bigger than a half,
Yes.
but it's less than 1.
Yeah,
Right?
Correct. All right.
Okay, so do you want to
do the next one?
do the next one?
All right. What happens when, and again, we get lucky on the prices. What happens if the price goes up from 2 to 4? We have a change in price that is $2. So the change in, so let me put the elasticity here, which is, again, the change in quantity over quantity divided by the change in price over price. And we get a $2 change in price, but the original price is now 2. So this is 2 over 2. And what's the change in quantity? Well, it goes from 5 to 2. So you lose 3 units of 3 apples, essentially, but you had 5, so it would be -3 over 5. Well, again, this stuff cancels out just by design because we forced the price to go from 2 to 4. But the elasticity is now -3 over 9 over 14. And which one is higher? I'm not even sure. This would be
that
3 times, this is times 3, 15, 9 over 15. So this one is slightly lower than this one. It's because of the curvature. Depending on the curvature of the demand function, you're going to get different elasticity.
That's kind of an advanced topic, though.
Yes,
So we don't-
so don't worry about it.
We won't. If you study economics at the upper division, you might see this a little bit more. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clean up this board and let Professor Jose take
Yeah.
over.
And then we're going to ask him tough questions.
talk about
I know.
talk about technology. And he can make sure to let us know if he needs any help. Maybe I should get my calculator out.
Yeah. We're
All
going to
right.
need it.
Take it away.
Okay, so I looked at the responses to the quiz questions, and I noticed that one of the questions that everyone seemed to get, or a majority of students seemed to get wrong, was the question about returns to scale, right? So should I answer that?
That's a question.
Therese Tamara. Okay.
Hello?
Oh, whoops.
Okay. So returns to scale has to do with what happens to output or the production level. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the right thing. What happens to output or the production level when we change the inputs, all right? So if you recall, I'm going to back up a little bit and I'm going to write a production function. Remember, a production function is output, the relationship between output as a function of the inputs. And let's say there's input 1.
Yeah, they can see everything.
Input 1, input 2.
Oh wait, not quite.
No.
Don't worry, I'll keep it. No, stay there. Don't erase.
Okay.
I got it.
As a function of the inputs. And to make things easy, let's assume that there's only two inputs. And let's talk about, say, the output of sugarcane. If you recall, that was one of the problems, one of the examples that we've used about Mario who owns a sugarcane plant. Okay, so we have sugarcane output is a function of, and we're going to assume that there's only two inputs. That's the quantity of labor that's used on the farm and the quantity of capital. Now remember, capital refers here to machinery, tools, any equipment, right? So typically a production function then shows us the relationship between the amount of the inputs used and the output that we get. Okay, so let's draw that over here. Let's put the output over here of sugarcane, and we're going to vary the amount of labor, except we're going to keep the amount of capital fixed. So think about this as that we have a set amount of land and a set number of acres, and oh, excuse me, not land. We have a
Also that.
Yeah.
also that.
Also that.
Okay, so let me change this a little bit. I'm going to back up. I know I'm looking at the wrong thing. So let's think about this as, I'm going to turn to a factory. Let's just say a factory. I'm producing cars, okay? There's cars, I need labor, and I need capital. Okay, so there's a plant. And so what I'm going to do is it's better to think that the factory, the size of the plant is fixed, and I'm going to vary the number of workers. So over here, then I have the number of cars produced. Here I have the amount of labor that I'm going to use, and then a production function typically will look like this. Okay, and this is for a fixed amount of capital. Okay, and I'm going to put, let's say, instead of I'm going to use a number. Let's say 100 units of capital. Okay, so this is the production function, and it shows the relationship between the amount of labor being used in cars holding constant the amount of capital or the plant, right? And so you can see as I add more labor, production goes up, increases, but at a decreasing rate. All right, now the question about increasing returns to scale has to do with what happens to total production when I increase the amount of labor and capital by the same percent. And so the example I'm going to think, let me put some numbers here to make this easier to see. I'm going to be a little bit more careful than Professor Nando. So I'm going to try to make the numbers work.
They're just hard.
Okay, so
we made it work.
There's 6 cars, and this is 2 laborers. Okay, so we have 100 units of capital. We have 2 workers, and as a result of combining the 2 workers with 100 units of capital, we are getting a production of 6 cars. Now, returns to scale has to do with if I expand labor and capital by the same percent, what's going to happen to production? Okay, so let's suppose that now one thing that you should know by now by looking at the videos is you know that the production function is going to shift upwards. And the reason it shifts upward is because we're going to be changing the amount of capital that is fixed. And okay, and so here we go. I'm reluctant to change it because I want to do this. I want to, here's the question. Here's output of cars. And I'm starting out with 6. The input of labor is 2, and the input of capital is 100. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double the amount of labor, double the amount of capital. So I'm going to move, so I'm increasing each by 100%. So I'm going to have 4 workers, 200 units of capital. And so the question now I want to know is I do know that this is going to expand. I'm going to get more output. But the question is, by what percent does it go up? Right? So actually the benchmark here, I'm going to do this like this. If this doubles, these doubled, and if this doubles to 12, then I know that my technology is what is called constant returns to scale technology. So if this goes to 12, I have constant returns to scale technology. If this goes to 14 or anything above 12, then I have what is called increasing returns to scale technology. If this doesn't double, suppose it goes up to 10, right? Then that means I have decreasing returns to scale technology. Okay, so let's look at this up here. The production function is going to shift up. Okay. And so I'll have QL, the new curve with QK equal to 200. Okay. So the production function is shifted up. And so I'm going to be using that. I'm using twice as much capital. Now I'll have twice as much labor. Now let's see what kind of technology I have. Do I have constant returns to scale, increasing returns to scale, or decreasing the returns to scale? Well, I can see that I'm going to have to fudge the number.
No, you can't fudge the number now. We're not letting you.
It looks like
It looks decreasing.
It looks like a decreasing return.
Yeah, no,
Like
no.
this.
You can't fudge the numbers. You
So-
gave us a hard time.
Okay. Oh,
Uh-oh.
these
Not-
guys are tough. Oh, I don't know.
No,
It
it's
looks
close. It's close, but
Looks
you're
close.
not gonna make it.
Let's
You're
see.
definitely not
No,
gonna
I
make
didn't make it.
No,
No.
no.
Okay. So,
But that's okay. That
It's
just
fine.
is, it is what it
It
is.
is what it is. yeah.
It is what it is.
so as you see there, I have decreasing returns to scale technology because I doubled all the inputs and I went from a production level of 6 to 12, which is,
To 11.
to 11, which is less than 12, which would have been constant returns to scale technology.
Why don't you write an 11 in there as the blue one, and then use this red pen and draw us what constant returns to scale
Would look like.
Yes, I will. Thank you. So I'm going to put 12 as the benchmark for constant returns to scale, but instead I actually got 11. I actually got 11, but 12 is the benchmark for constant returns to scale. So constant returns to scale, would have
Right there. Yeah.
right there. Would look like that. If I really had constant returns to scale, let me draw that darker so you can see. Point would have been here. Okay. And so that's the benchmark. So this production function shifted up by less than the benchmark. Had the production function actually shifted even higher, that is, if I had 14, then I would have increasing returns to scale, right? Do you guys have any questions?
No, not really, but I would want to make a point is that one interesting just geometric fact. Oh, you want to do that? Okay, all right, sorry.
One interesting geometric fact that Professor Nando reminded me of is that you get a straight line when you've drawn this correctly, connecting the points when you have constant returns to scale.
Yeah.
Oh, too much caffeine.
We need a big ruler. I have a big ruler.
Or terrible drawing skills.
That's caffeine. That's caffeine.
Comes back to haunt you now.
Yeah. Okay.
And the reason is because you're doubling the stuff on the horizontal axis, and you're also doubling the vertical axis. A quick test.
Yeah, it's a quick test. It's a geometric property that if you point along a straight line, will reflect the fact that it's increasing by the same proportion.
Exactly.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I got nothing else.
Okay.
So in this section also, we discussed the can you show us how you would find the marginal product of labor?
Oh, okay. So
Holding capital constant?
the marginal product of labor is actually represented by the slope of the production function. And so it's dependent upon, it answers the marginal product of labor and answers the question of what happens, what is the additional production that you get as a result of increasing only one of the factors by 1 unit. And that is represented by the slope of the production function. So let me, I don't want to clutter things over here, so I'm going to move over here to the right. And so let's say I'm over here, and I have 6 units of labor already. I'm using 6 units of labor. And then I increase labor by 1 unit to 7. Go from 6 to 1, so that I've had 1 more worker, and then I want to check to see what happens to production. And as you can see, the level of production rises from this, which is almost 11, to about 11.5. Okay, so there's a half increase in the number of cars produced as a result of a 1 unit increase in labor. So the marginal product of labor along this segment is 1/2 car. Okay, so it's the slope, the distance across, the distance up, which is 1/2 car, divided by the distance across, which is the slope of the production function. One thing to notice is that if you look down here, if I go from 2 workers to 3 workers, okay, and we do the same sort of exercise here, what you'll notice is that I get, when I'm using relatively few workers and I add an additional worker, I do get a bigger bump or a bigger increase in the number of cars produced. And in this case, I move up to about, let's say, 8. Okay, so the marginal product of a worker when I don't have very many workers is higher here than it is over here where I have relatively more workers. So in this case, the marginal product is 2 cars of adding 1 more worker, whereas here the marginal product was only 1/2. And I think we refer to that as the law of the diminishing marginal product.
Yeah.
So any other questions?
I got nothing.
All right.
Okay.
So we have, let's just recap a little bit.
Well, okay, go ahead. I do have one other.
Okay,
Okay,
go for
then
it.
go for it.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that I would like to have Fernando or Kara do for me is, they were talking about demand and elasticity, but one thing I was puzzled about is what happens when there's when you see something like this, okay, so let's say here's the price of an SUV, and here's the demand curve for an SUV, for SUVs. Here's the quantity of SUVs. And so suppose that something like this were to occur, where the demand curve shifts back, okay? What are things that could have caused the demand curve for SUVs to shift back?
Well, let's say that if you are a consumer, you drive not a very nice car, but if you make more money all of a sudden, you decide to drive a better car, and SUVs tend to be better cars.
But
And I'm just saying that if that's your attitude towards SUVs, then one thing that could happen is that if you lose income, then you would tend to not want to drive SUVs and you would go back to a bad car. And so that would decrease your demand for SUVs. So a negative income shock or a decrease
in income? Decrease in income?
Decrease in income could
cause the demand curve to shift
back.
if we think most goods, that's true. Normally
that's true, and that's why they're called normal goods.
So those are SUVs are kind of nice things.
Normal good.
So let's think about what would happen if the price of a complement were to rise. What's a complement?
I don't know, soccer balls?
The SUVs? That's good. That is good. That's good.
The price of children.
Yeah.
That's good.
All right. I'm thinking more like gasoline.
Gas. There you
Gasoline
go.
is a complement. So we use gasoline and SUVs together. So let's suppose the price of gasoline rises. So an increase in the price of a complement.
Okay, that's really good. Increase.
So it could be gasoline, soccer
And
balls,
price of complement.
Costco membership.
I was thinking of soccer or gas because that's what I am, and I'm soon going to have to get an SUV.
So increase in the price of gas.
Yep.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So then, so increase in the price of gas causes a shift backwards or a reduction in the demand for SUVs. So what would cause, so that's a compliment. What about substitutes? Would that substitutes?
Some other type of car.
Substitute.
What's a good substitute for an SUV?
Station wagon. I like
Pickup truck? I don't know.
Let's say they're just giving them away. Station wagon. Or so a decrease in the price of a substitute.
Decrease, meaning people then are shifting out of this
Exactly.
and
and
buying.
into the other. Okay. Decrease in the price of substitute. And what did we say was a good substitute for SUVs?
Station wagon.
Station wagon. A
Hey.
sport
Do they
wagon.
make station
They
wagons?
do.
They make
I
it
think
anymore.
you can get an Audi station wagon.
Station wagon is a substitute.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Very good.
I think those are the ones that we have focused on.
Yeah, that's
Mostly
pretty much
in
what
this
we focused
class.
on in class. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Any other things we should cover?
Okay. So as we're moving into the exam, we went to the material on the first exam. Professor Fernando and I talked about the budget constraint. We talked about indifference curves. We talked about finding the optimal consumption bundle.
Mhm.
We talked about how the optimal consumption bundle changes as something changes. It's important to do all those things. We derived a demand curve. We calculated the elasticity of the demand curve. We showed how the demand curve shifts. And then Professor Jose introduced us to technology and returns to scale. All of these topics you can anticipate seeing questions about on the exam. And if going forward, if you have any questions, feel free to post in the discussion boards and we'll answer them. Thank you for watching.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.